Hello, everybody. Today I will be giving a presentation on the logic of evidence. Okay, so first off, I'm going to start by giving some intuition of what we're going to be talking about. First of all, essentially, it is logic of belief. Um, so, of the traditional modal operators that are used in formal epistemology, uh, belief is the modal operator we will be concerned with and talking about here. And I'll give some intuition before formally defining everything about what evidence is in our context here, what we're defining evidence to be. First off, each state or world is assigned a set of sets of states. Each individual set of states is an evidence set or just evidence. So, like, imagine we have three worlds, W1, W2, and W3. Each of these worlds will have a set. Let's take W1 for example. It will have a set assigned to it, and in that set will be smaller sets, and each of these smaller sets will consist of worlds. It will be a set of worlds, and each such small set is going to be called evidence or an evidence set. And if X is evidence, W is a world, and W is an X, then X is evidence for W. So yeah, that's essentially uh, uh, essentially an evidence set will have a few worlds in it, and this evidence will give us reason to believe that one of the worlds that is in it is the actual world. So our evidence, an evidence set, has evidence or has reason for us to believe that the worlds inside that evidence set, one of them is the actual world. They're all contenders for the actual world according to the evidence. And each set of sets, each like big set assigned to each world, is the evidential state of the agent. That is all the evidence acquired by the agent at that world. And just to give some motivation as well before we start formally defining everything, um, why is this logic of evidence interesting to us? Well, first of all, or most importantly, it is a good model of how we humans arrive at our quote unquote knowledge and beliefs. So, faced with possible worlds, like if we're faced with possible worlds and we don't know which of them is the actual world, we rank their plausibility according to the available evidence. So, let's give an example. Let's imagine if I were actually giving this presentation in real life in front of you in class, as normally we would. And imagine I like bring out my phone, do something on it, and put the phone behind my desk. And then you hear the sound of a dog barking coming from behind the desk. Well, what could possibly be the reason for this? Well, one possible reason is that there's an actual dog behind the desk barking, and that's what's making the sound. Or perhaps what I did on my phone was play a video of a dog, and the sound you hear is just the sound of the video playing. Now, faced with these two possible worlds, which will you believe to be the case? I think most everybody would answer that they would believe that it's the case that it's just the phone, my mobile phone, is the one that's making the sound. Now, why do we believe that is the case? We have these two possible worlds in front of us. Uh, uh, like both are possible, but we believe that it is the case that the sound is coming from the phone. We rank it as a more plausible world than the world where there's a dog behind that desk. And the reason for this is the evidence. So, for example, uh, it's very unlikely that I'll be able to get a dog past security and up the building and sneak him and hide him in behind the desk without anyone noticing all that time. That's one reason, that's one evidence. Another piece of evidence would be that you saw me do something on my phone and put my phone there, so it's possible that what I played was a dog, and perhaps the sound of the dog barking doesn't sound like an actual real life dog. It sounds like it's something coming out of a digital device. These are all pieces of evidence, and using these evidences, we rank our possible worlds according to which is more plausible, and based on that, we form our beliefs. And this is essentially what we will be doing in the next in the coming slides. We will be making some formal definitions, all with this motivation to capture this intuitive idea formally. And another reason it is a good model for us is it helps us, a good model of how we arrive at our knowledge and beliefs. It helps us keep track of how we arrived at our beliefs. As you will see soon, the logic of evidence helps us maintain a track record, sort of the reasons we have for arriving at our beliefs. And that's just what we just did in my previous example. When I asked, why do you believe that the sound was that of a phone, not a real dog? You gave me a list of reasons, and so we sort of are able to keep track of how we arrived at our beliefs. And now let's start with the formal definitions. First we define the language we will be talking about. Now let at be a fixed set of atomic prepositions. Then let L, our language, be the smallest set of formulas generated by the following grammar. P is just an atomic preposition, or not phi, or phi and psi, or B phi, E phi, A phi, and this symbol, let's call it the plausibility symbol, or plausibility ordering symbol, phi. Additionally, we will be using this notation for a shorthand, these like brackets, B between brackets, or any modal operator between brackets phi. It's just shorthand for, in the case of B, it is not the case that B not phi. And this is similar to like if you're using the box operator, the box symbol as the modal operator, then we also usually have the diamond operator, which is defined similarly to how this is defined. So this is kind of like the diamond operator here. And similarly for the remaining modal operators, EA and the plausibility symbol. And the modal operators should be interpreted or read as E phi should be read as the agent has evidence for phi, B phi should be read as the agent believes that phi is true, the plausibility symbol phi, the agent safely believes that phi is true, and A phi is true in all states. As you can notice, A phi is just like the classical modal operator of necessity. That is, phi is necessarily true. Phi is true in all states. Now some more definitions. First off, a signature is a subset of A, B, of our modal operators. A signature is just a subset of our possible modal operators or modal symbols. Now, let sigma be a signature containing E and not containing A. And the reason the authors mentioned for not including A in the definition, or in the signature in this definition, is because they consider A to be always taken. So even if our signature is just like B, or if our signature is B and E, and A is not mentioned in it, we still have A taken with us. We're always taking the modal operator A. Now a sigma structure is a tuple M, consists of W, a set of worlds, as you can see where W is a non-empty set of worlds, a list of I of M, where M is one of our modal operators, and I of M is just the interpretation of the symbol. And from here on forward, after this definition, we will omit the use of the I of the function. When we want to talk about the interpretation of like a function of a relation symbol of one of our modal operators, we will just we won't say I of E from here on forward. We'll just say E. And from context, we will be able to tell usually what we mean, the symbol or the relation. And V, which is, as we will see, the evaluation function. Now, if E is in the signature, then the interpretation of it, what it means is it's a relation on worlds and sets of worlds. And then that's the evidence relation. So as we mentioned previously, each world will be assigned a set of sets. So if we take as an example, we're at a world W1 and we have a set containing smaller sets. Each let's say one of the sets has just W1, and one of the other sets has W1 and W2. Then in that case, our relation, if we look at our relation as a set, it will have W1 and the set containing just W1, and it will also have W1 and the set containing W1 and W2. If our plausibility ordering is in the signature, then its interpretation is it's a plausibility order on W. And what that means is the relation is reflexive and transitive. And as you can see, you can probably guess by the choice of this symbol, it's an ordering. It's sort of like the less than or equal relation. Um, that is, like if we use this symbol, it will have an object on the right hand side and an object on the left hand side. And it sort of means that the object on the right hand side is somehow bigger or the same or equal to the object on the left hand side. And if B is in our signature, then I of B is a binary relation on W. As previously mentioned, B is usually going to mean the belief relation. And V is just the valuation function. It takes an atomic proposition and returns a set of worlds, specifically the set of worlds in which that atomic proposition is true. Now, you will see this soon in our uh, uh, definitions of truth in our language here. Now, another definition is a model. A sigma structure is a sigma model if it further satisfies the following constraints. One, for each world, uh, E of W, we already defined E as a relation, but from here on forwards, the authors use E as a function. That is, it takes a world and returns a set of sets of worlds. So it just returns the set that's assigned to it that we talked about in the beginning when we were giving an intuitive explanation. So yeah, so the first constraint is that for each world, the empty set is not evidence for it, for our world, and capital W, that is all the worlds, the set of all worlds is a piece of evidence at our world W. And the reason for this constraint is we don't want an empty set to be a piece of evidence because that's an inconsistent piece of evidence. It's self-contradictory, sort of, because when you think about what that would mean, if you have an empty set as a piece of evidence, then it's like saying we have a piece of evidence that gives us reason to believe that none of the possible worlds is the actual world. So it's sort of like saying the world does not exist, and that's sort of absurd because, like, if the agent is reasoning, it must be reasoning in some world, you know. And this constraint is sort of to say that the agent is always aware of what are all the conceivable worlds. It always knows what are like the possible conceivable worlds that it might reason about. The second constraint is if we have the plausibility ordering in our signature, then for all worlds W, V, and U, if V is more plausible or as plausible as W, and W is in some evidence set X for a world U, then V is an X. And what this just means is that if W is in our evidence set and there is a world V that is more plausible than W or as plausible as W, then that world V is also in that same evidence set. So, like, if you have a piece of evidence that makes us believe that W might be the actual world, then our evidence, that same piece of evidence should also give us reason to believe that all other worlds that are more plausible or as plausible as W may also be the actual world. And that makes sense. Like, if V is more plausible than W, then whatever reason we have to believe that W might be the actual world should also give us reason to believe that V, the more plausible world, might also be the actual world. And the third constraint is whenever W is less plausible or as plausible as V, and W is accessible to you through B, it follows that V is accessible to you through B as well. And that's also similar a bit to the second constraint. If a world V is more plausible than a world W, or as plausible, of course, and at our current world, we're considering W as possibly the actual world, as like we're considering to believe that it is the actual world, then we should also be considering V, the more plausible world, that it might also be the actual world. We should also be under consideration for our beliefs. And finally, an evidence model is just a sigma model where the signature consists of only the evidence relation E. Now, some things to note about our definitions. You may realize that sources may or may not be reliable. That is, an evidence set need not contain the actual world. But as you have noticed, we don't have any conditions that state that a piece of evidence must contain the actual world. It might be that a piece of evidence does not give us reason to believe that the actual world is the actual world. So the evidence or the sources of the evidence may not be need not be reliable. And as I've stated, a piece of evidence may not be empty. It may not be consistent. It may not be inconsistent with itself. But different pieces of evidence may be inconsistent with one another. In which case, the intersection between the evidence would be empty. So, like if you have two pieces of evidence and their intersection is empty, then they somehow contradict each other. They uh, they both give us reason to believe that totally different worlds, totally disjoint worlds, may be the actual world. And as we've already mentioned, for models, however, no evidence may be empty. And the whole universe W is always a piece of evidence, i.e., the agent knows what all the conceivable worlds are. We already mentioned this as well. Now, defining truth in our language L. Let M be a model. So the truth of a formula phi in L is defined inductively as follows. The first three scenarios are the ones you will be very familiar with. An atomic proposition P is true in M and W if and only if W is in the set resulting from applying our valuation function on P. So it's just P is true in M and W if and only if W is one of the worlds in which P is true. Not phi is true in M and W if and only if it is not the case that phi is true in M and W. Phi and psi is true in M and W if and only if each of phi and psi are individually true in M and W. E phi, which is the agent has evidence for phi, is true in M and W if and only if there exists a set X, an evidence set X, such that X is a piece of evidence at our world W. And for all worlds V in this evidence set, phi is true in all those worlds V. So what this is just stating is we only say that our agent has evidence for phi if one of its pieces of evidences, which has multiple worlds in it, if phi is true in all the worlds in this piece of evidence, then this piece of evidence gives us good reason to believe phi. So in that case, the agent does have evidence for phi. Now, B phi is true in M and W if and only if for all V, for all worlds V, if V is accessible to W by B, then phi is true in M and V. This is just like the usual modal operators, how we define truth for them. It's nothing new here. The plausibility ordering phi, which is read as the agent safely believes that phi, that is true in M and W if and only if for all worlds V, if V is more plausible or as plausible as W, then phi is true in that world V. So this makes sense. Just saying that if a formula phi is true in our world and in all worlds V that are more plausible than W or as plausible, if phi is true in all of these worlds, then the agent can safely believe that phi. And this is just the classical modal operator, the necessity operator. A phi is true in MW if and only if for all worlds V, phi is true in them. So if it's just true if phi is true in all worlds. Now, so far what we've been doing is defining what a model is, like what a general model or a general structure is. And if anybody wants to define a model, they can just need to make sure to adhere to the constraints in the previous slides. But they'd have to define each relation explicitly and individually, and like they'd have to go through it all. But what we will do now, and what we can do, is also explicitly state only the evidence relation, and from that evidence relation derive the rest of the relations, as we will do in the coming slides. And this seems like something we should be able to do because, for example, like the example we gave in the beginning of the dog barking, what we did is we first checked the evidence, and based on that evidence, we ranked the possible worlds in front of us according to plausibility. According to the evidence, we determined the plausibility according to the evidence. And then based on this plausibility ranking, we formed our beliefs. So this is something that we want to be able to do. And effectively, this would also enable us to interpret an entire language L on purely an evidence model. So we won't need to include in our signature the other modal operators. We can just have an evidence model only containing the evidence relation, and from that derive the other operators and relations we need. Now, some things also to note. Nothing in our definitions stops us from having empty intersections between evidence sets in a single evidential state. This was already mentioned. So this means that an agent can have a piece of evidence that is inconsistent with another of its evidences. So while it is unlikely for an agent to be able to combine all their evidence, there will likely be maximal collections of evidence in their evidential state which are consistent. We call those scenarios, and it motivates the following definition. So what this just means is, even though an agent will unlikely be able to combine all their evidence in one world, there will likely be some different pieces of evidence that are consistent with one another, and we will have maximal collections of such evidences. So we will have, like, just maximum means we will have the largest possible collection of evidences which are consistent with one another. And this is what we will define now here. We will just define it formally. It just means the same thing, and we will use this soon in our derivations, as you will see. So a W scenario, W is a world. A W scenario is a maximal collection X subset, a subset of the evidential state. So X will just be a set of sets of worlds that has the FIP property, which is the finite intersection property, which just says that for each finite subfamily, as stated, X is a set of sets of worlds. X is a family of such sets. So for each finite subfamily of X, where X1 to Xn, where each of these is just an evidence set, it's just a set of worlds, we have that the intersection of all these sets will be non-empty. So this is just formally stating what we've already mentioned, that we will have different pieces of evidence in our evidential state that are consistent, and and this is just a definition for the such a maximal collection of evidences. And the collection is called a scenario if it is a W scenario for some state or for some world W. Now, just some things to note before we define our belief relation and our plausibility relation. Note that having evidence for phi does not necessarily imply our agent believing phi. So just having evidence for a formula is not enough for the agent to believe that formula. Also, an agent should believe phi only after considering all their evidence. Our definition of our derived belief relation, as you will see, depends on the subject formula phi being true in some W scenario. In other words, it has to be true in some maximally consistent theory based on our evidence. So it has to be sort of the case that the, the biggest set of consistent evidence we have, if phi is true in that big set of consistent evidence, then in that case, the agent should believe phi. So now we go to the definition. Given an evidence function E, which takes a world and returns a set of worlds, which is just like the set assigned to that world, we define our relation B on worlds, on two worlds, by WBV, if V is in the intersection of such a W scenario X, for such a scenario X at our world W. So this is just also formally stating what we've already talked about. That if a world V is in a maximally consistent theory in our world, in that case, the agent should be considering V for belief. So V should be accessible to our world W by B in that case. Now, as for the plausibility ordering, we want to define our derived plausibility ordering so that V is more plausible than W if every set that is evidence for W is also evidence for V. So that's just what the definition is stating formally. Given an evidence function E, we define the plausibility relation as, we define it on pairs of worlds by W is less plausible or as plausible as V, if whenever uh, uh, whenever a world W is in an evidence set X of a world U, then V is also an X. So just in other words, or to state it more simply, if a world W is in some piece of evidence at our current world, and V is a word that is more plausible than W, then V should also be in those exact same pieces of evidence that are evidence for W. So because V is more plausible than W, then any evidence that is evidence for W will also be evidence for V. Of course, here it should be read as V is more plausible or as plausible as W. I'm just omitting the as part because it just takes time. I think we're all aware of that now. And now this is just an example. So let's consider three pieces of evidence, X, Y, and Z, with these following worlds in them. In this case, W1 is less plausible or as plausible as W2. Now let's check that. What are the sets that have W1? Well, only X has W1, but X also has W2. So this satisfies our definition. So W2 is more plausible as is more plausible or as plausible as W1, but not the other way around. So we can't switch W2 and W1 here in this case, because if we take a look, the evidence sets that have W2 are X and Y. They both have W2, and W1 is in X, but W1 is not in Y. So it's not the case that W1 is more plausible than W2. And similarly for this, just another example. And here's also another example with three evidence sets X, Y, and Z. In this case, W2 is more plausible than W1 because any evidence set that has W1, which is just X, also has W2. And similarly, just another example. Okay. Given an evidence model M, we now define the extended structure M delta, which is the same as M, but it also has our derived relations B and the plausibility relation. Now take note that structures M that have an evidence relation and an arbitrary belief relation and a derived plausibility relation, these are not necessarily models according to our definition. And the problem is with the second constraint on models, which says uh, if V is accessible to W by B and U is more plausible than V, then U is also accessible to W by V. This condition is not need not necessarily be satisfied by such a structure. And here's an example where we have our universe, the possible worlds are just W and V, and the evidential states of these two worlds are the same, and they just consist of the one sorry the one set W that is all the possible worlds, and B is equal to this. W is just the only world that is accessible by B is W to itself. W is accessible to itself. In this case, obviously, W is accessible to W by B, and V is as plausible as W because the evidential states of both worlds are the same, and they're both equal to um, uh, they both only have one piece of evidence which has all the worlds. So V is as plausible as W in this case. But it is not the case that V is accessible to W by B. And as you can see here, this pair is not in the set of the relation B. But this is a structure according to this. This is a structure similar to this, but it's not necessarily a model. However, this can never happen over an intended model. So it's not just enough to derive our plausibility ordering. We need to derive both if we want to have an intended model that is necessarily a model. And that is actually a lemma. It's proven. Suppose that M is an evidence model, then M delta, our extended structure M delta, is a model according to definition 2. And here's a very simple proof. Now, condition is one is satisfied with the definition of evidence models. What condition one said was just that no evidential state has the empty set as a piece of evidence, and every evidential state has the entire universe W as a piece of evidence. This is satisfied by the fact that M is already an evidence model. It's like it's in the assumption, and our extended structure M delta does not have any effect on E. Just adds two new modal relations, but it doesn't have any effect on E. So condition one won't be nullified by this construction. And condition two is obviously satisfied. And what condition two said is that if a world is in some evidence set, then any other world that is more plausible than that. So if W is in an evidence set, then any world V that is more plausible than W will also be in that evidence set. Now, condition is satisfied because it is in fact the template with which we defined our plausibility relation. If we go back here, yes, here, as you can see, this is just how we defined our plausibility relation. If V is more plausible than W, then any evidence set that has W should also have V. So our condition, the second condition for a model, is also satisfied. Now, as for condition 3, we'll have to do a little bit of work. Condition 3 said was that if world W is accessible by the belief operator, then any other world that is more plausible than W should also be accessible by that same belief operator. It should be accessible to the world we are in. So we assume that W is accessible to U by B, and V is more plausible than W, and show that V being accessible to W by B follows. Well, since by our assumption W is accessible to U, there is a scenario X such that W is in the intersection of all the sets in this scenario. And this is just this is just by the definition of our belief relation. This is how we define the belief relation, that if W is accessible by the belief, or I'm sorry, if W is in the intersection of all the pieces of evidence in some scenario, then W is accessible by the belief relation. But since V is more plausible than W by our assumption here as well, then it also follows that V is in the intersection of all those all those evidence sets in our scenario X. And since X was a U scenario, we have that V is accessible to U by B. So we've satisfied. So according to the definition of our belief relation, V is also accessible to U now by B. I'm sorry. Now we give some special classes of evidence models. So far, we've only been speaking about like general cases. But there are certain types of situations an agent may encounter that have interesting consequences. So definition 8, and the reason we just jumped to definition 8 all of a sudden is just because this isn't the 8th definition in the presentation, but it's the 8th definition in the paper. So this is for if somebody wants to go back and read the paper and check these definitions, this is just for their own benefit, for their sake, that they're able to see which definition it is. So suppose that M is a model with these operators, with these modal operators. We say M is flat whenever X is evidence at W. Then there is a world V in our evidence X such that V is accessible to W by B. Now, in other words, what this just says is that, in other words, for any piece of evidence the agent has, one of its worlds will be under consideration by the agent as an actual world. So, if in our world we have for all the evidence sets we have X, there will always be one world at least in that evidence set such that it is accessible by our belief operator, which just means that it is under consideration by the agent as that the agent is considering to believe it to be the actual world. And this is in fact a lemma. Now, according to our definitions of truth in our language, if Emma is a flat model, then this formula is true in it. This formula is true in our flat model M. That if the agent has evidence for phi, that implies that the agent is considering phi as the actual world. The agent is not ruling phi. The agent is not ruling out that phi may be the actual world. So phi is consistent with the agent's beliefs. And we won't go through the proof, but it's proven in the paper. Now, some more terminology. If M is uniform if E and B are constant. Now, what this just means is that for the case of E, that at all worlds the evidential set is the same. It's constant. No matter which world you are in, the evidential state is always going to be the same. And this is useful. This is a useful definition, because sometimes we want to model a situation where the agent has all the evidence right from the get-go. So it doesn't matter which world the agent is in or the agent will be in. They have all the evidence right from the get-go. It doesn't matter if anything changes, if the world they are in is different, the evidence will always be the same. And this helps us capture this situation. So that's what it means for E to be constant. And B also should be constant in a uniform model. So what this just means is that for worlds U, V, W, if V is accessible to W by B, then that implies, and like if and only if, V is also accessible to U by B. So what this just means is if V is accessible to some world W by B, then it should be accessible to all other worlds U by B, for like an arbitrary world U. So for any world, for any other world. So yeah, so M is uniform if E and B are constant, and whenever B is accessible to W by B, it follows that V is like plausibility maximal. And what this just means is that like V is the most plausible world. Now M is concise if it is flat, uniform, and whenever W is like plausibility maximal, then W is in B. Since what it means for B to be constant is, as has been explained, that if a world is accessible uh, by B to one world, then it is accessible to all other worlds as well. So it doesn't matter which world you are in. The sets of worlds that will be accessible to you is constant. So it can be considered as just a set. We can consider our belief relation as just a set, because sort of the left-hand side of the relation doesn't matter. So yeah, so M is concise if it is flat, uniform, and whenever W is plausibility maximal, then W is in B. Now finally, the last thing we're going to be talking about, because we're running out of time. In the paper, they've also laid some axioms that are needed for any sort of inference system around this evidence, around this logic of evidence. So, like they call an inference system a logic. So these are the axioms for an evidence logic. And as you can see, they have labels here on the right. Some are labeled with all, some are labeled with this small b, and some with bu, some with u. And this just means these labels just tell us which of these axioms we should take in our inference system, depending on what type of models we're talking about. If we're talking about general models, like no assumptions about them, then we should take all the axioms that have all. If if we're only talking about flat models, then we should be taking the axioms that have this b, small b symbol. And this is actually a musical note, and it's called flat. So I think this is a clever use of notation, that for axioms that should be taken for flat models are labeled with the flat symbol. So yeah, for a signature sigma, EV superscript sigma denotes the logic that takes axioms marked with all. So if EV is like an inference system without any assumptions, just a general inference system, it's an inference system for a general model, then we should take all the axioms labeled with all. And similarly, for an inference system with subscript this flat, the symbol flat, we should take axioms marked with all and the axioms marked with this symbol. And similarly for U, and for an evidence logic with subscript B flat U or BU, this denotes the logic that takes axioms marked with all and with BU. So to essentially take all the axioms, because the flatness, uniformity, and maximal axioms also have the BU symbol, the BU label, and the conciseness has the BU label. And yeah, as you may have noticed as well, the axiom for flatness is the one that that was proven in lemma 2 semantically. It was proven. So like according to our definitions of truth. So in an inference system, we want to take it as an axiom naturally. And this symbol subscript lambda denotes derivability in the logic lambda, where lambda is just one of the possible inference systems we've talked about. And now we present our first theorem in the presentation, but it's actually the second theorem in the paper, which is a soundness result for all our different types of inference system. And it just says, let's read it. The logics EV, EVB, EVU, EVBU are sound for the classes of all sigma models, all flat models, all uniform sigma models, and all concise sigma models respectively. So what this just says, like as we've mentioned before, EV is just the inference system for a general sigma model. So this inference system is sound for all classes of all sigma models without any natural assumptions without any assumptions about them. And this inference system with the subscript flat symbol is sound for all classes of flat sigma models, and similarly the inference system for uniform models, the one with the subscript u, it is sound for all uniform sigma models, and the inference system with the subscript flat u, which is the inference system for concise sigma models, it is sound for all concise sigma models respectively. And obviously, this is a very significant and important result because naturally, for any inference system, we always want at least soundness. We always want to have at least soundness because, of course, we don't want our inference system to be able to derive from it false formulas, false conclusions. So soundness is very important. So this is a very important result. There is also a completeness result, but it's more detailed and it builds on some things that we haven't had the time to explain, so we won't be able to mention it. But that's just for your own benefit to know that a theorem result exists in the paper if you want to look at it. And yeah, so this is the important theorem we will be ending with now because we're unfortunately short on time. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you have a nice day and stay safe, everybody.